I'm going to tell you a story that still haunts me, even though several years have passed since it happened. I've thought about it so many times, reliving every second, every decision I made, wondering if I could have done something different. I'm a private investigator, something I decided to do after retiring from the police force. I thought I had seen it all. Infidelities, fraud, disappearances. Nothing could surprise me, or so I believed. But there was one case that not only surprised me, it left a mark on me. A case unlike any other I had. A case that showed me the true darkness in people. It all started one Tuesday morning. A woman named Sarah called me. She could barely speak, her voice was trembling, and every word she said seemed difficult for her to get out. She told me she suspected her husband, Richard, was cheating on her, that there was something off about his behavior. She told me how Richard came home late from work with excuses that didn't make sense, how he stepped away to take phone calls and sent messages at hours when, according to her, he shouldn't. You know, the typical signs. She was devastated. I could hear in her voice that although she wanted to know the truth, she was also afraid of what she might find out. Of course, I agreed to take the case. I knew Sarah wasn't the first nor the last person to go through something like that. She wanted answers, and that's what I did, provide answers. The first thing I did was follow Richard. He worked at an advertising agency downtown, and at first I didn't notice anything unusual. A man who went to work, came home. No clear signs that he was seeing someone else. That made me think that maybe everything was in Sarah's head, that she was just paranoid, that maybe there was another explanation. But something inside me told me not to let my guard down, to wait. And I was right. A week passed, and on a Friday afternoon, Richard left the office earlier than usual. I didn't think too much of it until I saw where he was headed. He took the road that led to a less frequented part of the city, a place where not many people go. Something felt off from the beginning. I followed him to a hotel, one of those places that looks discreet on purpose. It wasn't a place where you'd go for a business meeting. There in the lobby, I saw him meet with a young woman. Both of them were uncomfortable, nervous, as if they didn't want to be seen. That confirmed my suspicions. The first part of my job was done. I had pictures of them together in the elevator, but I didn't leave. Something was off. Something about their movements didn't quite add up, so I decided to stay a little longer just in case. I followed them from my car. I could see them go up to the third floor and disappear behind the curtains of one of the rooms. I stayed in my car, watching. Night fell and the hotel lights came on, faintly illuminating the curtains of the room. I told myself I had enough, that I could leave and close the case, but something, a gut feeling, told me not to wait. So I did, and what happened next will haunt me forever. I could see movement behind the curtains. At first it looked like a normal conversation, but then I noticed the woman started gesturing frantically. She was nervous, waving her arms in the air while Richard sat there, head down as if waiting for something. Suddenly everything changed. The woman stood up abruptly as if she wanted to leave, but Richard grabbed her arm, stopping her. My heart stopped for a second. Something wasn't right. Before I could react, I saw the worst. Richard pulled out a knife. It was quick, like a flash. He started stabbing her over and over without stopping. The woman tried to defend herself, but it was useless. She was completely defenseless. Everything happened so fast that I froze. Fear paralyzed me, and for a moment I just watched, unable to believe what I was seeing. The man I had followed for days, that ordinary man, was committing such a brutal act that I couldn't comprehend it. It took me a few seconds to react. With trembling hands, I took out my phone and called the police. I could barely speak, but I managed to give them the address and tell them there was a murder in progress. While I waited for them to arrive, I turned on my phone's camera and recorded everything that was happening. I couldn't let this man get away. I had to make sure he paid for what he was doing. I felt a mix of horror, helplessness, and an urgent need to act, but all I could do at that moment was wait. The police arrived within minutes, but those minutes felt like an eternity. They surrounded the hotel, entered quickly, and just seconds later I saw them escorting Richard out in handcuffs. He seemed to be in shock, as if he couldn't believe what he had done. Meanwhile, paramedics attended to the woman. She was alive, but barely. The bloodied knife was left as irrefutable proof of what had just happened. At the station, Richard confessed to everything. He didn't resist. He was broken, emotionally shattered. I sat in the interrogation room watching as he explained in a monotone voice that he had acted out of jealousy, that he had found messages on his lover's phone, and those messages indicated she was seeing other men. To him, it was the ultimate betrayal. He couldn't take it. What he said next sent chills down my spine. If I can't have her, no one can. I could barely listen to what he was saying. The whole case, everything I had seen and heard up to that point felt unreal. But the reality was there, right in front of me, and it was horrible. The worst part was thinking about Sarah, Richard's wife. She hadn't just been right about the infidelity. Now she had to face something much worse. How do you tell a woman that the man she shared her life with not only cheated on her, but also tried to kill someone? The trial was quick. Richard pled guilty and was sentenced to a long prison term. The woman survived, but I don't know if she'll ever be able to get past what she went through. Sarah, devastated, did the only thing she could. She left. She moved away, far from the memories of what her life had been. As for me, I was forever marked by what I witnessed. I had seen many things in my life, but never anything like that. Never something so brutal, so visceral. This case changed me. From that day on, I stopped seeing things the same way. I became more cautious, more aware that even the simplest situations can turn terrifying in the blink of an eye. I was never the same after that. That day taught me that danger is always there, lurking even in the most ordinary situations. What began as a typical case of infidelity turned into a nightmare. And the worst part is, I could never shake the feeling that if I had done something differently, if I had acted sooner, maybe the woman wouldn't have been on the brink of death. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't followed my gut, if I had left the case after taking those first photos in the elevator. I would have let everything take its course, and Richard might have gotten away with his crime. Or maybe the woman would have died right there with no one knowing the truth. But I didn't. I stayed, and although I did the right thing by calling the police, the guilt of not intervening sooner still weighs on me. In the days that followed, I tried to get back to my life as a private investigator, but every time I tried to work on another case, the images of what I saw in that hotel came back to me. I couldn't stop reliving that moment, seeing Richard's face transform into a monster, hearing the sound of the knife cutting through flesh. What disturbed me most was that, up until that point, Richard had seemed like a normal man, and that made me doubt my ability to read people, my skill as an investigator. If someone like him was capable of such an atrocious act, what other people might be hiding inside? The questions piled up. When did Richard decide that killing was the only option? Was it a spur-of-the-moment thing, or had he been planning it for weeks, maybe months? During the interrogation, he mentioned the messages he found on the woman's phone. But were those messages really enough to trigger that level of violence? No one can justify what he did, but I struggled to understand how an extramarital affair, something that happens all the time, had led to that level of madness. I spent days visiting Sarah. She wasn't in a position to face what had happened alone, and although it wasn't my responsibility, I felt like I had to be there to help her process everything. I explained as gently as possible what I had discovered. The tears that flowed from her eyes when she heard the word infidelity were nothing compared to the emotional breakdown she suffered upon learning about the attack. She couldn't understand how the man she had shared her life with could have done something like that. I saw in her eyes that even though Richard was in prison, she would never feel safe again. She would never trust anyone again. Those visits to Sarah were heartbreaking. There was nothing I could say or do to ease her pain. The life she had built with Richard was broken irreparably. A part of me wished I had convinced her not to go through with the investigation, to let things take their course without getting involved. But I knew that sooner or later the truth would have come out, and the impact would have been just as devastating. Time passed, but the case continued to haunt me. I couldn't escape the feeling that at some point I had crossed a line I shouldn't have crossed. My job had always been to uncover the truth, but I wasn't prepared to deal with the darkness that was revealed that night in the hotel. There's a fine line between infidelity, deceit, and violence, and I had seen how that line can blur, how the most primitive human emotions, like jealousy and fear of abandonment, can transform a person into something unrecognizable. A few months after the trial, I decided to take a break. I needed to get away from the work, the cases, everything that reminded me of that moment. For weeks, I found myself wandering aimlessly through the city, trying to find a way to disconnect. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't leave behind what I had seen. The image of Richard with the knife in his hand kept coming back to my mind, over and over again. The worst part was that even after everything that happened, I couldn't help but question my own morality. I had spent so many years in the police force and then as a private investigator, seeking justice, uncovering truths. But now I wondered, was I really prepared to face those truths when they presented themselves? Had I done everything possible to protect the people involved? Or in some way, by investigating and exposing what was happening, had I accelerated the tragedy? The work of a private investigator seems simple from the outside. Follow leads, gather evidence, uncover secrets. But sometimes those secrets are too dark, too painful. And once you bring them to light, there's no way to go back. There's no way to undo the damage that's been done. I've solved many cases since then, but none has had the impact this one did. Sometimes when I'm alone in my office, I think about Richard. Not the man who stabbed his lover, but the man he was before that moment. I wonder at what exact point he broke, when he stopped being an unfaithful husband and became a murderer. I wonder if there was something I could have done to stop it, to prevent things from spiraling out of control. And although I know I can't change what happened, the guilt is still there, buried but always present. Every time I take on a new case, that night comes back to my mind. It reminds me that the truth can be a dangerous weapon, that human emotions can be more unpredictable than they seem, and that sometimes darkness is closer than we think. I used to work for a private investigation firm called AIS. AIS stood for Atlas Investigative Solutions, and at the time they were probably the most respected private investigation firm in the United Kingdom. They only hired ex-military and ex-police officers, and even then they didn't take just anyone. They'd invite you for an interview, talk about your service record and credentials, and they were very thorough. They wanted the best, and in return, they offered extremely generous salaries. In 1991, an old friend of mine received a call from one of their recruiters not long after we were both discharged from the Army. But since he had promised to be more family-oriented after his discharge, he turned down the job in favor of a local 9-to-5 position. Knowing I was single and more interested in padding my bank account than living a quiet life, he put me in touch with the recruiter. I should tell you right now that around 60 to 70% of private detective work is extremely boring. AIS might have been one of the most trustworthy and respected firms in the UK, but that didn't mean we were all playing James Bond. Most of our clients were upper-middle-class professionals with the occasional celebrity or high society member discreetly requesting information. But the types of jobs we did for those people were, for the most part, the same as for anyone else. The only difference was the location. What was somewhat unique to the upper class were the cases of missing non-vulnerable persons, as we called them at AIS. I personally handled half a dozen different cases involving children of wealthy parents who had gone missing, but I use that term very loosely because 9 times out of 10, they were just going through a rebellious phase and had run away from home. One girl went to live in a vegan commune in Hackney. The police found her, but she didn't want to go back home, and since she had just turned 18, there was nothing they could do about it. As long as she wasn't breaking the law, she was free to do what she wanted. But that wasn't acceptable to Mom and Dad. They wanted to know where their little girl was, so we'd follow them, watch them, hack their phones, all sorts of things, and their parents would spend tens of thousands every week for that privilege. As I said, I must have worked 6 or 7 of those cases on my own. So when I was told there was a missing person case available, I thought it would be more of the same. But from the start, I could tell this one would be different. The clients were based in my native Scotland, in a small town called Crossley near Glasgow, and that's partly why I was offered the job in the first place. I figured since they were paying a lot of money to find their missing person, they'd be living in some countryside estate with a Range Rover parked out front, but I was wrong. They weren't poor or anything, obviously living a relatively comfortable life, but they weren't anywhere near the type of client I was used to dealing with at AIS. And their missing person wasn't some spoiled kid who'd run off with their dad's credit card. What they were was desperate. The missing person they wanted to find was their son, a 21-year-old boxer who, to protect the anonymity of his family, I'll just call Robbie. After he first went missing, his parents reported him to the police, but after months and months of investigation, the case had gotten nowhere. But it wasn't that they had made some progress, questioned a few suspects, and then run out of leads. Robbie's parents said that officers had hit a complete wall of silence. No one had seen him, no one had spoken to him, and it was as if he had walked out of his parents' house and vanished into thin air. By the time I was called for the job, a campaign organized by local volunteers had just run out of funding, with the Russia police having only one officer working on the case, and only sporadically. Robbie's parents managed to scrape together enough cash donations to involve AIS, which I can assure you was no small feat, and that's where I came into the picture. The first thing I did was gather all the background information on the case, which included a fairly intimate profile of the missing person. Generally, people who disappear have had some issues in their lives, whether it be alcohol, drugs, infidelity, or some other type of addiction that results in large debts or even larger mistakes. But Robbie's parents insisted he wasn't involved in any of that. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, was religious about his diet. Everything in his life seemed to revolve around his potential career as a professional boxer. He kept out of trouble and had even gotten a job at a local pub to save up money to move to Glasgow, where he'd have access to some of the best boxing gyms in Scotland. What I'm getting at is that there were no obvious warning signs with this young man, not until I asked if there had been any sudden changes, or if he had met anyone new in the weeks or months leading up to his disappearance. Robbie's mother told me there was something she had mentioned to the police very early on in the investigation that she felt they had overlooked. They asked her the same question about new people appearing in Robbie's life before he went missing, and here's what she told them. One evening, in the days leading up to his disappearance, Robbie received a phone call from someone his mother didn't recognize. This was back when families tended to have just one big phone, usually kept in a fairly common space. For young people like Robbie, there was no such thing as privacy when it came to phone calls, so when the phone rang that evening, his mother was the first to answer. She thought she knew the voices of all her son's friends and trainers. Robbie was a popular young man, and he received plenty of calls from friends, trainers, teammates, and sparring partners, but his mother always asked who was calling and would chat with them whenever they called. She knew many of them by voice or by behavior, but she didn't recognize the man who called that night. And when she asked, the man simply said, "I'm calling from the pub." He didn't give his name, didn't sound particularly friendly either. He just asked to speak to Robbie. His mother called Robbie to take the call, and after a brief conversation, Robbie thanked the caller and hung up, but not before calling him Tony. Robbie's mother had never heard anyone named Tony mentioned, and that immediately struck her as unusual. As I said, she thought she knew practically everyone in her son's life. She even knew most of the people he worked with at the pub, along with the names of some regular customers, because Robbie would often come home and talk about his shifts with her. He'd mention his boss and a few of his colleagues by name. He even had special nicknames for some of the regulars who came in, but at no point had he mentioned anyone named Tony, and if they were close enough for Tony to call him at home, she found it very strange that he had never mentioned him before. Robbie's mother had brought this up to the police not once, not twice, but 3 times, and each time they told her the lead was a dead end. No one named Tony worked at the pub. None of the regulars recognized the name, and in the end, the police told her it was an insignificant detail, and that they were taking their investigation in a different direction. Robbie's mother said that at the time she accepted their decision, but as time passed, it began to bother her more and more, and it bothered me too. To me, the Tony piece wasn't a dead end. It was a loose thread. The Tony matter wasn't the only loose thread either, because from what I learned, the whole pub angle had been completely overlooked. Robbie had been scheduled to work that night, but he never made it to the pub, and the police had decided that whatever caused his disappearance had occurred during the 30-minute walk between his house and his workplace. I understand why the police focused on that stretch of road, canvassing the nearby houses for potential witnesses, and only viewed the pub as a place to gather information. But to me, it was definitely something that needed to be looked into again, especially since the pub and this mysterious Tony character seemed connected somehow. After speaking to as many of Robbie's friends as I could get in touch with, which I initially thought would be my main line of investigation, I decided to move on to the pub. But I couldn't just walk in, declare myself a private investigator, and expect people to give me previously undisclosed information. Instead, I'd have to blend in as an unremarkable patron to gather as much information as possible in the most undercover way possible. The money Robbie's parents had raised had bought them 2 weeks of my time, so knowing I'd be spending a lot of time at the pub where he used to work, I moved from the Glasgow Travelodge I'd been staying at to a small bed and breakfast within walking distance. Then over the next few days I started showing up at the pub. My cover story was that I was a recently divorced father of two staying at a cheap B&B while trying to get back on my feet. That way, it made sense that I was hanging around the pub all day, nursing pints and maybe betting a few pounds on a horse race or two. It was that kind of lower-class rural pub pints, pies, and the occasional gamblers huddled in corners with their racing newspapers. And though I hate to admit it, I fit right in. After having spent so much time in the military, I was used to hanging around some dodgy pubs, and being perched on a bar stool with a few pints was probably the best time I'd had on the job. In fact, it was quite fun at times. The bar staff and regulars seemed like good people, but I still kept my mind on the job and listened as much as I could. I'd pop in and out over a few days, a pint at midday, another in the late afternoon, and then I'd come back early in the evening when it was busier. By the fifth day, I was getting a pretty warm welcome from some of the regulars, and even the usually grim-faced barmen seemed to be softening up a bit. Obviously, they were getting quite comfortable with me, which suited me just fine because it meant I could start asking the odd question without ruffling any feathers. But as it turned out, I didn't need to ask questions to hear Tony's name mentioned. I was sitting there on a Thursday evening pretending to watch the football they had on the TV, when a scruffy-looking bloke in a green parka walked into the pub. He greeted one or two people, but only in passing as he made a beeline for the bar with a very serious expression on his face. He ended up standing right next to me as he caught the barman's attention, but thinking he was just going to order a drink, the barman only gave him a look while he poured a pint as if to say, "What'll it be?" The scruffy bloke then shook his head, beckoned him over, and then asked, "Is Tony coming in tonight?" He didn't whisper it by any means, but he clearly didn't want to broadcast his question to the whole pub. The only problem was that he said it right next to the one person who had a personal interest in hearing it, and as you can imagine, as soon as I heard that name, I perked up. The guy asked about Tony, and in a similarly muted tone, the barman told him that Tony would be in later that night. The scruffy bloke then asked the barman to pass along an apology to Tony if he saw him first, to which the barman replied, "Save it. I'm not the one you need to impress." And the way he said it, it was as if his scruffy acquaintance was walking to his doom. After the barman's quiet scolding, the scruffy bloke left the pub looking very, very worried, and immediately I started forming an idea of who this Tony was. But again, I've changed his name to protect the innocent. Clearly, he was someone people were afraid of, which meant Robbie's mother had no idea how right she was to be concerned. In fact, she was very right to be worried about Robbie. I knew I needed to find out more about this Tony, so I finished my pint, left for a few hours to get something to eat, drink some coffee, and generally sober up a bit so I'd be in working condition. A few hours later, I was back on the same bar stool, keeping an eye out for anyone who looked like Tony. I was halfway through my second pint, and getting more worried that the barman's tip had been wrong when a guy who looked as wide as he was tall walked in. He had a massive gold watch, all kinds of rings, a gold chain around his neck, clearly had plenty of money, and didn't mind showing it off. He also looked like he had spent most of his life lifting weights and not without a little help from the pharmacist, if you know what I mean. I had to wait until he reached the bar before getting confirmation, but as he walked through the pub, the way everyone stared at him behind his back told me everything I needed to know. He reached the bar and I heard, "What's up, Tony?" from the barman. Tony ordered a Guinness, sat at the bar, and then he and the barman started talking quietly. But this time, since the pub was a bit busier and they were farther down the bar, I had no idea what they were saying. I had the feeling I was missing something I wanted to hear, but then Tony finished his Guinness, told the barman, "See you Sunday," and left. I kept up my cover and returned on Friday and Saturday just to keep up appearances. Then on Sunday, I was in the pub from the moment the doors opened, waiting for Tony to show up again. He came in just after 3, plopped himself at the bar and asked the barman to put on the boxing channel after ordering his Guinness. The barman did as he was told immediately, and then for the next few minutes, Tony was glued to the TV over the bar, absorbed in the boxing highlights they were showing. Now I know a thing or two about boxing, enough to use it as a way to strike up a conversation. But what really caught my attention at that moment was when I reminded myself that Robbie, my missing person, had been an avid and dedicated boxer. I just can't overstate how exciting it was for me to feel like a lead was starting to take shape in that way. And again, it showed just how right Robbie's mother had been to be worried about him. Her son and this Tony were now connected in 2 ways, and given the esteem people seemed to hold him in, I realized just how big a mistake the police had made by not pursuing that lead. So while I'm sipping my pint, I start making comments about the boxer's form, their punching skills, things like that. I wasn't addressing Tony directly, just invoking that old pub tradition of speaking aloud until someone joins the conversation. It probably sounds a bit crazy now that I'm writing it down, but it worked. And before I knew it, Tony and I were having a stop-start conversation. I introduced myself, not offering my real name but a variation of it, then bought him a pint when I finished mine. He asked me how I knew so much about boxing, and I told him another variation of the truth when I said I used to help a mate train for fights when I was in the Navy. Turns out he'd also been an amateur boxer in his day and still had a huge passion for the sport. Then he asked me what I was doing in Crossley, and I gave him the whole sad story about being newly and bitterly divorced. Tony seemed pretty disinterested by the end of my explanation, so to keep him engaged, I asked if he ever bet on fights since he knew so much about boxing. He grimaced and then said something like, "That rubbish? Nah, not anymore." To keep the conversation going, I acted like I used to be a big gambler before I got married, and that now I was planning on getting back into it since my wife no longer had control over my finances. He rolled his eyes, but he was still with me when I asked if he had any tips or something, like any young talent he knew of. Then he told me the best advice he could give me was not to bet on professional boxing. According to him, it was all rigged, the referees were bought, the boxers took dives and followed scripts, all to funnel money into the hands of the bookies. Maybe it's the cynic in me, but I can't say I didn't agree with him a bit, so I asked him a very genuine question and asked what combat sports were good to bet on. He just stared at the TV for a while without saying anything, then gave me this very sinister look. Tony smiled, but he had this look in his eyes, that wolfish, almost bloodthirsty look. He started telling me about small kickboxing fights in Thailand he had attended, and how if you knew the sport, you could win thousands of US dollars in a single night betting on these little events of 100 spectators in the outskirts of Bangkok. He said the big fighters were just in it for the money, but the little fighters, the hungry young ones, fought with much more emphasis on honor and skill. They fought literally for their lives. A few wins in the lower divisions could mean their names popped up at bigger events, and the money they won could catapult their families out of poverty. That, according to Tony, was the purest form of fighting there was. Everything else was just theater. He seemed to know a lot about boxing outside the sport itself. He knew about the betting side, but he also seemed to know a bit about the promotional side. So I asked him what he did for a living, meaning if he was involved in that promotional side or if he ran a gym or something. He said he visited a gym, which was pretty obvious by his appearance, but that he hadn't been involved in organizing events for years. According to him, it was too much stress, not enough money, and then he added, "I'll stay on the TV side of things, thanks." I took two things away from this part of our conversation. Number one, Tony didn't answer my question at all. He dodged telling me what he did for a living. And number two, he was lying. I know it's a cliche in detective stories at this point, but you really do get a sense when people are lying to you. And when Tony told me he hadn't been involved in boxing promotion for years, I knew it wasn't true. Everything else he told me was accurate, but that part wasn't. He was still involved in some capacity, just not comfortable telling a stranger, which for me was like striking oil. I had my number one person of interest connected to my missing person in more than one way, and not only did I have a strong suspicion that he was lying to me, but I was 90% sure he was involved in some kind of organized crime. Robbie needed money to move to Glasgow, and if Tony was involved in loan sharking, that could explain his disappearance. And by that I don't mean he didn't pay up and they rolled him up in a carpet and dumped him in a lake. I mean a lot of people get in debt and then just disappear voluntarily, mostly because they're afraid of said carpets. People do it with the big banks too. They try all kinds of scams, disappear, change their names, even fake their own deaths. So when some big ex-boxer threatens to break your legs if you don't pay up, voluntary disappearances are surprisingly likely. I wasn't 100% sure Tony was loaning money, but I wasn't about to ask him during that first conversation. When you're working undercover, those first contacts are about building trust. If you push too hard, you push them away. I had to wait until the next day to see Tony again, but when I did, I had a plan prepared. I told him I'd love to buy him a pint, but I was short on money, that my soon-to-be ex-wife wouldn't let me access our joint account because we'd already signed the divorce papers. So until I could sell off some things, I was skint. Any loan shark worth their salt would see that as a clear business opportunity, but all Tony did was offer me his sympathies before offering to buy me a pint instead. I took him up on his offer, surprised that my loan shark theory had been dismissed. And then I asked if he knew anyone who might be interested in lending me some short-term money. Again, he shook his head and told me he didn't know anyone who could help me. But then, after a pause, he asked, "You definitely have money coming in on Friday?" It was a very loaded question, but what really caught my attention was how Tony suddenly seemed to have a bit of that wolfish look in his eyes, like the one he had before. I told him yes, that I definitely had money coming in that Friday, which at that point was only the next day. Then he asked me, "You definitely know boxing, yeah? Enough to bet on it?" Again, I told him yes, I knew boxing and definitely enough to bet a few pounds, at which point Tony's expression became very intense. He stared at me for a few moments, then told me, "If you want to win enough money to live well for a few years, come to the pub at closing time on Saturday night with a couple of grand in cash." And with that, he finished his Guinness, said his goodbyes, and walked out of the pub. I immediately reported to my bosses that I had a major lead on a person of interest, and then I told Robbie's parents that their suspicions about the mysterious Tony character were definitely justified. The only problem was that I had no physical proof that Tony's criminality was connected to Robbie's disappearance, just strong suspicions. We knew Robbie needed money, that was the only reason he was working at the pub. It was a stepping stone to something bigger. So, what if Tony had been the one offering him money through some kind of illegal betting operation? Robbie could have gotten in too deep, made a bet he couldn't fulfill. Or maybe he threatened to expose Tony's criminality after being cheated out of his winnings. There were a ton of possibilities, but as I said, I had no evidence for any of them. What I did have, though, was a golden opportunity to gather said evidence by meeting Tony at the pub at closing time on Saturday. I didn't have any kind of hidden cameras I could use, but I did have one of those old-school dictaphone recorders I could place in my jacket pocket. That way, I could record whatever conversation we had and potentially get audio that would be of great interest to the police. And that was the only sure way we had to get the investigation into Robbie's disappearance back on track and ensure it was headed in the right direction. It was an exciting moment. The first time in my career I felt like a real secret agent, but unfortunately for me, that midnight meeting would result in my second brush with near certain death. As instructed, I made sure to be in the pub before closing time on Saturday night. It was a nervous wait, but eventually Tony showed up. However, instead of coming in and sitting at the bar like he usually did, he just caught my attention from the doorway and then motioned for me to follow him. I left the pub with Tony in the lead, and as we walked towards his car, he turned around, giving me the perfect opportunity to reach into my pocket and switch on my dictaphone. The tapes were small and only had about 45 minutes of recording time, but there was no way I could switch it on in his car without raising suspicion, and he had his eyes on me as we walked out of the pub, so I had to do it then or not at all. As we walked towards his car, I saw two blokes sitting in the back seat of a gray Mercedes. I'll be honest, this raised some alarms, but there was also a chance that, wherever we were going to bet my money, Tony figured it was better to bring some muscle along. So I walk over to his car, get in the passenger seat after giving a nervous nod to the heavies in the back, and then we're off to our mysterious destination. Obviously, the first question I asked Tony was, "Where are we going?" He gave me one of those wolfish smiles and said, "You'll see." We kept driving for a minute or two, and since I didn't know the area well, I had no idea where we were headed. Then, after the silence became a bit awkward, I asked if we were going to bet on a boxing match. He told me could be, and then asked if I had it with me. Assuming he meant the money, I lied, told him yes, patting a bulge in my jacket pocket that contained a pair of rolled-up socks. Not exactly Hollywood-level props, but small deceptions like that can be very effective. Then I asked him what kind of fight we were going to bet on. Tony paused before speaking, then asked if I remembered what he said about those Muay Thai fights in Thailand. I remembered exactly what he'd said about those hungry young fighters and how fiercely they fought. Tony had also mentioned that some of those fights were unsanctioned events, sometimes organized between towns or villages. Your best fighter against ours for honor, glory, and unimaginable riches for those with the courage to stake their hard-earned money. And that's when it hit me. Tony wasn't taking me to a boxing match he knew was rigged. He was taking me to an unsanctioned and illegal fight he had organized. I had to remind myself that I was recording the whole conversation, and since he was talkative, I decided to ask some much more direct questions. I remember asking him with a sort of feigned horror, "It's not bare knuckle, is it?" Tony didn't say anything, just nodded. Then I asked if the fighters ever got hurt. He told me combat sports can be dangerous. Sometimes people go down and don't get back up. Harsh reality. I stayed silent, not so much because of the brutal honesty behind Tony's words, but because I suddenly realized what had happened to Robbie, the missing person. A clean-cut kid like him would never have gambled his wages, but what he might have done is accept an offer to fight in one of those matches if it meant walking away with a fortune in prize money. Enough to move to Glasgow. Enough to start his dream ahead of schedule. I thought I had the perfect opportunity to ask, and given what Tony had just said, I felt like he was on the verge of admitting his involvement in Robbie's disappearance. But when I asked if anyone had died in the ring recently, he told me, "I think that's enough questions for now, don't you?" And as he said that, I started recognizing some of the buildings we were passing, but they didn't make any sense. They meant Tony had been driving in circles for 10 or 15 minutes just to bring us back to where we'd started. I asked Tony again, "Where are you taking me?" And once again he told me, "You'll see." And seconds later we pulled up in front of a building I instantly recognized. It was the B&B I was staying at. We sat in the car for a second before Tony slowly turned to face me. I kept up the act for as long as I could, asking if he was playing some kind of prank. His response made my blood run cold. "We know who you are." I was scared, but I knew from my training that I had to stick to my story, so I told him I had no idea what he was talking about, that I was exactly who I said I was. But it didn't matter. I was still trying to reason with him when one of the heavies in the back seat leaned over my shoulder, grabbed the dictaphone out of my pocket and then held it up for Tony to see. He took it and then asked me, "How many more of these do you have?" The heavy in the back seat must have seen me fiddling with something in my jacket while walking to the car, but at that moment all my terrified mind was thinking was, how the hell did they know? Knowing it was probably pointless, I decided to stop lying and told Tony the dictaphone was the only one I had on me. Then he told me we were going to go up to my room for a chat, and if I said a word to anyone in the B&B, anyone who might still be awake at that hour, he'd burn the whole place down with me inside. We went up to my room, and while Tony's heavies ransacked the place, it was very surreal to watch them do it in silence. He told me to sit on the bed. Apparently, he and his guys had decided to do a bit of background research on me before committing to taking me to an illegal fight, and whoever Tony was, he was much more well-connected and powerful than I could have ever imagined. Tony started explaining that I'd caused him a lot of problems. His routines would have to change. He couldn't go to the pub anymore, all because he knew he couldn't trust me not to tell my bosses everything he'd said. He said he might not have been able to stop me from talking in the past, but he could certainly stop me from talking in the future. And with that, one of his heavies pulled a length of electrical cord out of his pocket. As the guy started fashioning a makeshift noose from the cord, Tony explained that killing me would bring a lot of unnecessary attention to him and his business partners, but faking a scene where it looked like I had taken my own life, that would cause much less fuss. I remember him saying something like, "A lot of ex-soldiers end up like that. No one would bat an eye if they found you hanging in a closet, would they?" I can't overstate how terrifying it was to know that Tony and his guys somehow had access to my service record, but ironically, it was that little detail that might have saved my life. When I was in Northern Ireland, one of the Land Rovers in my section was ambushed by the IRA near a place called Crossmaglen. I was wounded while we fought our way out, but 2 of my section mates lost their lives. The wounds I suffered eventually resulted in my discharge from the army, and apparently Tony had read all about it. He was ready to kill me, ready to fake a tragic, self-inflicted end. But after reading about the incident where I'd been mentioned in dispatches, he decided it was poor form to kill someone who had already cheated death once. He gave me a big speech about how we were both soldiers and then said, "Honorable soldiers don't kill each other when the battle's over. The winners and the losers come to an understanding." And according to Tony, that's exactly what we were going to do. We didn't come to an understanding so much as Tony imposed terms. The only reason he'd mentioned the young boxers getting killed in those illegal fights was because he accepted that certain people deserved to know what had happened to their missing family members. They needed to accept that their loved ones weren't coming back so their hearts could heal, and they could move on with their lives. But that said, Tony was all I'd get out of him, and if any of my colleagues decided to visit Crossley in the future, I'd be the one who'd pay the price. Tony and his guys didn't just know about my service record and who I worked for, they knew where my mom lived. Any further attempts to interfere with his operation, and it would be her who ended up hanging in a closet with a note saying she couldn't take the arthritic pain anymore. That was obviously what terrified me the most, the idea that he could hurt my own mother. But what really broke me was the fact that he knew her name, where she lived, and about the medical condition she'd been struggling with for most of a decade. And even as someone immersed in the world of information retrieval, I was astonished at how Tony could have gathered all that information in just a few days. That's when I realized that Tony couldn't have been running the illegal boxing ring on his own. He must have had some very rich and powerful partners to obtain all my personal information that quickly. For all I know, they hired one of AIS's competitors, which I can assure you would have cost them an astronomical amount of money if they wanted their information in that kind of time. After shaking hands on our little agreement, Tony and his heavies left me in a ransacked room, having taken all my notes and dictaphone tapes. I left crossly with my tail between my legs, having been dramatically and unexpectedly outplayed. I told my bosses everything, that I'd been compromised, that my family was at risk, and to their credit, they made arrangements to secure their safety. But more importantly to me, I told Robbie's parents everything. That hadn't been part of the agreement between Tony and me, as I think he knew very well I'd never accept that term. I told them that while I had no proof, I was certain Robbie had been manipulated into participating in an illegal boxing match, and I also told them there was a very good chance Robbie had suffered fatal injuries during one of those fights, and that the organizers of the event had then covered up his death. In all likelihood, his body would never be found, and his killers would never be brought to justice. And while with all the information I could pass to the police, Tony would be on the run, knowing full well his involvement in the operation had been compromised. I apologized to Robbie's parents again and again for not being able to bring their son home, but they showed patience and strength of spirit, and that was the closest thing to evidence of a higher power that I've ever seen. They told me what I had done was enough, that I had brought them more answers and more closure than the police had in nearly a year of investigating. They didn't care that Robbie's killers wouldn't face justice in life because, in their opinion, the justice they'd face in the great beyond would be far greater than anything they'd have to endure in life. I was a homicide detective with the NYPD for a little over 16 years. 16 years of misery, pain, and death every day. I wish I could say that getting a conviction for a suspect I'd cuffed was satisfying, but it wasn't. In my first year on the job, we caught a guy who had killed 2 tourists just to take a few dollars from their wallets. That same guy took a plea deal, served only 14 years, and was out during the second to last year of my time working for the Detective Bureau. I think that's when I decided I'd had enough. As a homicide detective, you want to take killers off the streets for good, not just delay the whole cycle of violence for a decade or so. I felt useless, like a cog in a machine that wasn't even working properly. Then about a year before I handed in my papers, I spoke with an old partner who had left the job to become an independent private investigator in Miami. He said it was the best decision he ever made, that he was making 3 times the salary without having to do any of the serious dirty work that made being a homicide detective almost unbearable. He also mentioned that if you build a good reputation for delivering on investigations, or if people hear you're a former cop, the job offers come so fast and frequent that you can pretty much pick the cases you want while naming your price. By then, I was divorced, with grown kids in college on the other side of the country, so there was really nothing tying me to New York City. And so, once I served out my notice period, I picked an apartment in Miami, booked a flight to Florida, and started my new life in the Sunshine State. I started by picking up the overflow work that my ex-partner couldn't handle. He'd get a call, have to turn someone down, but give them the old, "I can't take it, but I know a guy, ex-NYPD like me, solid worker, smart and diligent." Time and again, this would land me well-paying PI jobs that mostly consisted of insurance and personal liability stuff. Basically, if someone made a personal injury claim against an individual or a company, I'd follow them around a bit to make sure their injury was legit and that they weren't hitting the gym or something in their spare time. But there was another kind of work that made up a big chunk of what we did, and that was suspected infidelity. A husband or wife would contact us saying they thought their spouse was having an affair. Then we'd follow the subject for a while, tracking their movements every time they weren't at the family home to see if, in fact, they were seeing someone else on the side. And, depressingly, more often than not, the suspicious partner's gut feeling was right. We'd catch them sneaking into some apartment complex with a bottle of wine only to leave the next morning with a certain glow about them, if you know what I mean. Sometimes it was more blatant than that, and more often than not, getting enough evidence of the affair required some serious tailing and surveillance work. And it was this kind of call that led to one of the most disturbing and terrifying cases I've ever worked on. One morning, my ex-partner called me and said he'd passed my contact info to a woman who suspected her husband was having an affair. When she called me, she gave me the typical rundown about how he was disappearing for unusual amounts of time, how his explanations for his whereabouts were inconsistent, and how their intimate life had nearly disappeared over the past few months. To me, it seemed like a clear case. All I had to do was gather the necessary photographic evidence, maybe capture some audio of the husband calling his mystery lover, and then collect my fee. While speaking on the phone with the woman in question, who I'll keep anonymous for reasons that will become evident, I took note of all the pertinent information about the husband's hobbies, habits, and whereabouts before starting to tail him. One of the main claims the woman made was that her husband would come home especially late on certain nights of the week and then disappear on the weekends. He claimed to be in certain places, like a bar for instance, and then his wife would call, only to find out that he wasn't there. It was a Sunday afternoon when I followed him from his house to the Glenvar Heights area of the city. I thought I had him nailed based on how he was acting when he pulled up in front of a house, looking around like a rabbit poking its head out of its burrow, looking guilty of something. When he rang the doorbell, I got my camera ready to take pictures of whoever answered, assuming it would be his lover. However, it wasn't a woman at all, but a man with whom he seemed to have a fairly friendly relationship. It wouldn't have been the first time I discovered that a husband or wife hadn't come out of the closet yet, so to speak. Affairs don't always happen with members of the opposite sex, but when I passed my findings to his wife and showed her the photos I'd taken, she told me that the man he'd been visiting was a close friend of theirs. It all made sense then, given that, as far as I knew, all they'd done was watch a Dolphins game on TV. I mean, I couldn't see the husband directly, but I could see the friend drinking beer and talking to someone who I assumed was our cheating suspect. Naturally, I thought this was a dead lead. I continued following the husband for about 3 weeks, and aside from a few occasions where he visited family or went drinking with coworkers, he only visited this particular friend during these unexplained absences. From what I could see by peeking through a crack in the curtains, the pair drank a few beers and watched a game together. Nothing objectionable at all. I tried explaining this to the husband's wife, how everything seemed innocent, and that I hadn't caught him going anywhere remotely sordid, but she wasn't buying it. She told me her husband had been acting increasingly strange recently, that he'd started saying some rather disturbing things in his sleep, like he was talking to a lover or something. When I told her I'd reached a pretty solid conclusion, one that didn't involve him cheating at all, and that I couldn't in good conscience continue the investigation, she offered me an extra $50 for 2 more weeks of looking for proof of infidelity. At that point, I didn't want to take her money. It would have been morally wrong to keep milking her, and it could end up ruining my good reputation in the process. But something about her pleas made me sympathize with her. That, and she didn't seem like the paranoid type. She was adamant there was something to her suspicions and that she could either keep paying me or try with someone else. That sealed the deal. I told her I'd work the case for 2 more weeks, but after that, she'd be on her own. The next time I followed him was on a weekday night, one where I had tailed him from his office downtown to the residence in Glenvar Heights. I thought it would be another night of quietly watching sports on someone's TV through a crack in the curtains. Only this time, the guy hadn't fully closed the curtains, so I had a much better view of the room they were supposedly in. I say supposedly, because after the husband was let into the house, he only joined his friend in the TV room for a minute or 2 at most, before heading somewhere else in the house. At least that's what I assumed, since he didn't reappear in the TV room for another 2 hours. That's when I realized that during each of these visits, he'd been following the same pattern of behavior. I had assumed he was watching TV with his friend, but he wasn't. The friend was talking to someone on speakerphone. I'd made a big error in judgment. Something strange was happening in that house, and it was something that was essentially confirmed as sordid when the husband left the house at one point in a semi-undressed state. He'd taken off his tie, his shirt was unbuttoned, and like something out of a bad movie, he'd forgotten to zip up his pants. The next time I followed the husband to his friend's house, I brought along a parabolic microphone with an attached recorder. This is a special kind of mic that basically uses a small satellite dish to pick up and focus sound waves. Although they don't always produce the best quality audio, even the more expensive models like mine, they can be highly effective for eavesdropping on conversations from a distance. I paid almost $1,500 for the model I use, but trust me, that thing has ended up paying for itself, and I've used it on more than one occasion to secure solid audio evidence in insurance fraud or infidelity investigations. So after the husband arrived at his friend's house, I pointed the parabolic mic toward the TV room window and listened in for anything incriminating. That's when the plot really started to thicken, as they say. From what I could pick up, the husband arrived, he and his friend chatted a bit, then there was an exchange of a considerable amount of money, with the husband handing over a large sum before heading off to another room. Again, after a few hours, the husband reappeared, sounding pretty ecstatic. The two guys chatted a bit more, and then the husband left. My first thought was that this was some kind of narcotics situation, that the husband was using his friend's house to shoot up heroin or something. The only way to confirm my suspicions was to stake the place out to see who else came and went. That way I'd know for sure if some kind of drug dealing was going on or if it was something even more sinister. And sure enough, the house received visitors multiple times throughout the day and night. Each time, there'd be a cash exchange before the visitor disappeared to another part of the house for varying amounts of time. From the kind of conversation happening before and after, there was no way to tell exactly what was being sold, or if the visitors were paying for time, drugs, or both. But during one visit, I heard something that could be my way into figuring out what was going on in that house. One of the visitors told the homeowner, through a series of implications and innuendo, that they had a friend who was interested in coming by to use whatever the guy was offering. The homeowner told them to pass along his address, but never to use cell phones ever, and then gave them a code word to use when they came by so he'd know they weren't cops. Bingo, I had my way in, and all I'd need to do was make a little round-trip visit to the house, and I'd know for sure what the husband of my client was doing when he was there. I thought it was something embarrassing, something sordid, but I could never have prepared myself for what I was about to find. I waited a couple of hours before making my move, making sure no one else was visiting, but also enough time had passed between visits so the homeowner wouldn't be too suspicious of me, pretending to be the referral from the previous visitor. So I walked up to the house, rang the doorbell, and then gave the homeowner the story that I'd been referred by the previous visitor along with the agreed-upon code word. At first, he seemed a bit cautious, but he let me into the house, showing me to the TV room, and then asked for $300 in cash before telling me to wait there while he prepared things for me. Still under the impression that the place was some sort of drug house, maybe he was cleaning up some vomit in the other room, maybe getting some clean needles. In my mind, these suspicions were practically confirmed when he came back to the TV room a few minutes later and asked if I was ready while peeling off a pair of rubber gloves. I followed him down the hall and noticed the smell of cleaning products in the air around him. But when he showed me into the room where I assumed all the other visitors had paid to be, my jaw almost hit the floor. The interior looked like an abattoir. One wall was floor to ceiling with animal cages, and inside were all kinds of smaller pets and other similarly sized animals. Cats, smaller breeds of dogs, guinea pigs, chickens, rodent-like creatures I later learned were chinchillas, and there had to be at least 20 to 30 different animals locked up in there. Then, in the center of the room was a large blood-stained wooden table, and on it were all sorts of tools and kitchen utensils. Like I said, I'd thought it was a drug house. I even toyed with the idea it might be some kind of brothel, but never in a million years did I suspect the place was some sort of death-for-hire business run by the homeowner. The fact that my client had suspected infidelity, given the strong sensual undertones, only to discover that the cause of her husband's long absences was that he seemed to get pleasure from killing small animals, was one of the most disturbing and revealing moments of my life. Even during my time with the NYPD Homicide Division, people killing people was bad enough. But humans taking the lives of small, innocent animals for what was apparently some kind of twisted gratification was something I've struggled to shake from my mind. I took some photos of the inside of the room, and then immediately left the house to call the police. As far as I know, the homeowner was arrested on charges of animal cruelty and is facing prison time for his crimes. Unfortunately, this was all before the previous administration signed a bill making animal cruelty a federal crime, so the guy isn't going to get as much time as I'd like. I showed the photos of the slaughterhouse room to my client with the firm recommendation that she move out of the house and file for divorce as soon as possible. I explained that more often than not, People who harm animals go on to hurt humans at some point, and I strongly suspected her life would be in danger if she chose to stay with him. After handing over the evidence and my recommendations to my client, the process of closing that particular chapter of my career was swift but emotionally draining. My client, understandably devastated and disturbed by the findings, took immediate steps to protect herself. She moved out of the shared home with her husband and began divorce proceedings. Simultaneously, she ensured that her lawyer had all the photographic evidence I had collected to use in her divorce case. The husband was arrested shortly afterward thanks to the quick action of the police, and the evidence I gathered also helped strengthen the case against him. Despite the laws at the time not treating animal cruelty with the severity it deserves, the case drew attention from several animal rights groups who rallied to ensure justice was done as much as possible. For my part, the resolution of the case left me with a bittersweet feeling. I was satisfied to have helped take a criminal off the streets and possibly prevent future crimes against innocent animals or even people. However, the case also reignited some of the reasons why I left the police force. The emotional toll of dealing with such atrocities was enormous, and although I had left the NYPD to escape the constant exposure to human misery, I found myself face to face with one of its darkest forms in my new role as a private investigator. This case was a turning point in my PI career. I began to be more selective with my cases, avoiding those that might lead me down such dark paths. However, the reality of my profession is that you often don't know how deep the well goes until you're already too far in. Reflecting on my journey, this case reaffirmed my commitment to justice, but also strengthened my resolve to take care of my emotional well-being. I started working more closely with therapists and counselors, both to manage the impact of the cases I handled, and to ensure I could continue doing my job without losing myself to the darkness that sometimes comes with it. Justice sometimes comes at a personal cost, and for those of us in law enforcement or private investigation, finding a balance between seeking justice and maintaining our mental health is crucial. This case, with all its complexities and horrors, was a brutal but necessary reminder of that truth.